Hello, I'm John Molesky. Welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guests today are Jennifer Turner, director of the Wilson Center's China Environment Forum, and Karen Mancl, who is a fellow with that same program, also a professor in the Department of Food, Agricultural, and Biological Engineering at The Ohio State University. And I know, Karen, you appreciate when I say "the" like all of the regulars at the university. Today, we're going to be talking about a project that started back in September of 2022 called Cultivating U.S.-Chinese Climate Leadership on Food and Agriculture, a partnership between Ohio State and the Wilson Center. And Jennifer, before we begin digging into the subject matter, could you tell us about the nature of the partnership and the newest publication that is now available?
Well, I've known Karen for about 5 years now, and she actually started off as an intern. That's a longer story, but yeah, we've been working together on, a lot on food, and I really wanted to do something on food and climate because of all the greenhouse gases in the world, 31% of it comes from the food supply chain. And a lot of, US and China were #1 greenhouse gas emitters in the world and focus a lot on fossil fuels. But if we ignore the food sector, it's all over. As they say in Chinese, "完蛋了."
I'm guessing
really
that's not commonly. I'm guessing that's not commonly known.
Nope,
How
and
big a
that's
role food plays.
and also, not at the China Environment Forum, I've been really lucky to have a front row seat on US-China climate relations and a lot of other parts of our environmental and energy sector relations. And food and agriculture, food ag have not been part of the climate conversations yet. So mind the gap. The Wilson Center and the Ohio State University, we're trying to fill it with information. And we over the past year plus, we've produced a whole bunch of blogs and webinars and podcasts. And then finally, just last week, we produced our roadmap for US and China to look at the food and ag sector for a way to lower greenhouse gas emissions and work together.
And I want to let our viewers know that's available now online at wilsoncenter.org. If you come to the programs tab and find China Environment Forum, you'll find it. Karen, so coming out of COP, we have some new, at least intentions stated by nations that they will work together, and chief among those, China and the United States, just because of their sheer size, them working together is critical.
Yes, indeed. And the other thing that we noted in our roadmap is that China and the United States are both food superpowers. The United States and China produce the most food, and also China is a big consumer of and the biggest market actually for U.S. agriculture. So it's really important to include them in this food and climate discussion because we're such big players.
Jennifer, should we be optimistic about the potential for collaboration? Are there precedents where the two nations have worked together in this way, or what should we expect?
Well, Karen can wax more poetic on this, but ag exchanges were the very first exchanges between the US and China after we normalized relations. But the unique space of food and agriculture is one that we don't compete, except for catfish. Another conversation later on that. But so because, as Karen just mentioned, our food sectors, we depend on each other. But that the issue of, our main topics we focused on in this first report was soil, rice, food waste, and cows. And last time I checked, I don't think there's geostrategic conflicts around soil. Sorry, Karen, she's a soil scientist, not trying to belittle your specialty, but that the idea that this is a kind of safe space where scientists in both countries have been working on some of these issues. The US is maybe, we can say, ahead in some, Chinese others, but it's a space where we can share lessons learned because it benefits both of our countries. The US and China in November did sign a Sunnylands agreement in California about how we're going to restart our climate cooperation. And they do mention food and agriculture. Not a lot of details, but methane is a big concern. And there's a lot of methane that comes from rice and cows. And if you want to get a bowl of rice and talk to Karen about methane emissions from rice. She's all.
Well, at the risk of another bad pun here, let's dig in a little bit on some of the details. And Karen, let's start with you and soil. Let's talk about, what do people need to know about soil and about rice and how they factor into this equation. I think when most people think of issues around climate, they don't automatically think of soil.
Well, one of the wonderful things about soil and agriculture is that there's a lot of emphasis on, we need to be pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. There's too much being generated. There's too much in the atmosphere. And guess what? Nature has developed a very efficient way of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that is plants. Plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and as those plants develop roots and then they die and decompose, that organic matter that's created stores that carbon in the soil. So the soil is a tremendous carbon sink, and one that is really underutilized. Part of the problem that we have with our modern agriculture and our modern construction practices is that when we disturb the soil and till the soil, we release that carbon that the plants have pulled in and stored. So in the United States, we've heavily promoted promoted conservation agriculture, a particular set of practices that encourage the sequestration of carbon in the soil. And about 25% of the farmers in the United States and more practice conservation agriculture. China is just beginning to look at conservation agriculture as a practice to both improve the quality of the soil and to sequester carbon. Only about 6% of China's farmland is under conservation agriculture. So it's an area that we can definitely improve. It's been talked about at the COP as a goal to help to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by sequestering carbon in the soil.
What is the barrier to doing that only 6% of farmers in China? Is it a scalable technology? Are the costs prohibitive? Why isn't that practice more widespread?
Well, one of the big obstacles is the equipment. The type of equipment that you need to plant plants in soils in farmland that's undergoing conservation agriculture, you need different types of equipment. You need a different type of planter. And in the United States, we started developing these planters, right after the Dust Bowl days, when we started to look at conservation agriculture to help to protect our soils, and these planters were developed. But China has a different style of agriculture, and they couldn't use our equipment. So it took some efforts through the Chinese Agricultural University to develop the types of planters. So those have been developed now, and they're starting to be demonstrated and distributed throughout the country so that farmers have the right tools. But it also takes a different approach to farming. So in terms of teaching farmers kind of a different way to farm, in the United States, we have the Cooperative Extension Service that teaches farmers. In China, they have a slightly different approach to teaching farmers, but it's getting the information out to teach them this new way of farming. The other
Jennifer, I'm sorry, go ahead, please go ahead.
Well, the other concern is you don't, in China, they're very, very concerned about growing enough food to feed their very large population, and they can't afford to lose any yield. And at first, when you switch over from this conventional farming to conservation agriculture, the yield can drop for a few years until you build up the quality of the soil. And there's a certain amount of resistance to adopting this new way of farming if you're going to do more work and not grow as much. And not
change never goes down easily, right?
Right.
No matter who we're talking about, farmers are no exception. So Karen, earlier Jennifer mentioned rice as one of the things highlighted in the new paper and in the focus of your work. What is it about rice in particular? Is it the crop itself, or is it the amount that's being produced?
Well, rice is a very interesting crop. Rice is grown in wet soils, flooded fields. And when you flood a field to grow a plant, And as those plants, grow and produce the rice, and then the roots and the other plant material starts to decompose, this is in a kind of a swamp-like environment. And one of the things that's liberated in swamps is a swamp gas, which is essentially methane.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, the Chinese word for swamp gas, for methane, is swamp gas. So methane is liberated in the natural production of rice because it's grown in these wet soils. So rice is really the number one emitter of methane of all of greenhouse gases of all the different grades. So it's a small problem in the United States because we don't grow a lot of rice in the United States. But in China, China's the number one rice grower in the world. So there's a great opportunity to perhaps change the way they grow rice in order to reduce the amount of methane. Why is methane important? When you look at the greenhouse gas potential of carbon dioxide, we'll call that 1. If you look at the greenhouse gas potential of methane, it's like 80. So it's way more powerful. So liberating, having methane moving up into the atmosphere has a very big impact on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions.
Speaking of methane, Jennifer, and this division of labor and what you're focusing on, I know you're going to talk to us about food waste and cows, another major emitter of methane.
Well, before I go there, I want to mention that we did, while we were doing our research and finding people for our podcast, we did discover a group of Chinese researchers and some US researchers that were working on a kind of perennial rice, so you don't have to replant it every year. And they were also looking into the climate benefits. So, we named that podcast the same as our chapter we call Rice, the Sticky Climate Challenge.
we have had more bad puns than anyone can bear.
Yes, we like, but yeah, well, the methane hoof print of cows is a big one. Cows, the most of the methane comes from their burps, like 97%. The other end, a little bit. Their manure, also a fair amount. But what's interesting is that we found that both in the US and China, there were scientists who were, well, particularly over the past 4 years, who had to go back to independently researching. I think a lot of these groups were partners before, but because of COVID and politics, they weren't working together. But looking at different ways how to approach this. Well, different additives to the food, red seaweed, the timing of the food, how to deliver these kind of additives, either like salt lick type things, breeding. So it's really interesting how that in both countries, while in China, the government is not yet heavily prioritizing agricultural climate emissions yet. It's more so on food waste and on fertilizers. Because they really see, the big elephant in the room for climate change for them is coal.
Yeah.
But still there are scientists that are working on this. And I think the scientists in China, when we had conversations with them, seemed to indicate like they're ready for it, right? When the government says we're doing cows, they say we're here at the dairy, we're doing it. But California in particular has been really big, not just with the scientists, but their emission trading system there also includes agriculture, so that there's financial incentives to encourage dairies to try low methane cow raising methods. And that's a kind of a bigger piece that we want to, take a bite out of later in our future work, is looking at how do we finance a lot of these good scientific ideas.
Similar to what I asked Karen earlier about rice, Jennifer, I want to ask you about food waste. Is the problem that if we wasted less, we'd have to grow less and we'd be doing less problems with soil and all the other? Is that it? Is that what it comes down to?
1/3 of the food that the world produces is lost or wasted. Loss is referring to what happens on the farm when it rots or doesn't get to the market. The waste, look in the mirror, everybody. It's the people, it's the restaurants, it's the hotels after the consumer gets it, that we don't store it well, whatever. And if food waste was a country, it would be the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. China's first, US second, food waste third. And so it's, this is the low-hanging fruit though, because food waste, industries often need to be kind of engaged on this, because you can't just go around blaming the consumers, because sometimes the infrastructure is not there to collect your food waste, to compost it. But a lot of like the West Coast states have been working with WWF and a group called ReFed about how they could come up with, incentivize industries, to the restaurant industry and others, to do more to reduce food waste. And it's a total win, because it's like, if you're wasting the food that you're producing, you're losing money, and the world loses water and soil, farmers waste their, it's a real no-brainer. And this is another area where I think the US and China, could be sharing lessons learned. China actually is one of the few countries in the world that actually passed an anti-food waste law 2 years ago. I mean, it used to be kind of a campaign, and, campaigns, they don't necessarily last forever, but they are getting much more serious and trying to come up with better ways of collecting and sorting the waste that they get. And so it's kind of exciting. So I think that this is, in some ways you could say we're on equal footing. And while China's, 1.4 billion people, so a lot more than us, but per capita, the Chinese are almost the same as the US now in terms of food waste.
I want to ask both of you a question that I'll apologize in advance because it's somewhat unanswerable, because it's a mystery question. But in the short time we've been speaking here today, both of you have made compelling arguments about how, if we're going to be talking about climate, we need to be talking about these things that aren't the headlines, where usually our focus is on fossil fuels. And my question is, if this is such a significant piece of the puzzle, why aren't we talking about it more? And I know that's a difficult question to answer, but I'd be one of our colleagues, Ruth Greenspan Bell, has looked at behavior and attitudes toward climate. She's thinking about a book about this, about why people are unmotivated to do the things that might create the most impact. And so I know it's a difficult question to answer, but I'd just be interested in both of your thoughts on this. And is it a growth area? Is this becoming more and more part of the conversation?
I mean, at the last, as you mentioned at the beginning, food is on the climate negotiation table. It started about 20 years ago. There was some discussions, but now it was right at one of the main declarations was on food and climate, which the US and China signed on with 150 plus other countries. We committed ourselves that now in our climate action plans, we have to walk the walk and actually have policies and targets to what to do on food waste or food, other greenhouse gas emissions. Should point out here, though, that under the Biden administration, with all the, the two main infrastructure bills and the IRA, it had in their infrastructure investments for food and ag and climate. In fact, the USDA probably, and I have to double check this, I think it's the largest grant program that they've ever started, right, Karen?
Yes.
It's called Climate Smart Agriculture. So trying to not only look at, everything from cows to rice and soil, but supporting companies, NGOs, farming groups to do some experiments, but also, so encourage the science, encourage better practices, and to incentivize action here. Because in the end, as Karen, was talking about, like, if you protect the soil, it keeps carbon in, but it also, makes your soil richer, and it helps guarantee food security. It's a crazy win-win-win-win, and I think its day has come. I know, Karen, am I too optimistic?
I think one of the problems that we have in terms of thinking about food and food production is that people are kind of removed from food and food production. When I first traveled to China in the early 2000s, more than half of the population lived in the countryside and worked on farms. And even in China, more and more people are moving to the city. In the United States, we have such a small percentage of our population that are involved in food production. So some of it might just be that we're, a few generations away from the farm.
Uh-huh.
We forget about the impact that that particular part of our society can have on reducing the impact of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change.
What if, but we are all involved in eating the food. And so I wonder on the cultural level, how sensitive it is to start to talk about how nations construct their dinner tables. It's like what you see with fossil fuels, right? People don't want to be told how much to drive or what to drive. Do we have similar barriers at play here?
Well, one of the really interesting things that I saw as I've been working with China over the last few past many years is that, food waste was not a big issue in China for 1,000 years. It had a very circular economy. Any food that was, quote, wasted was either diverted to animal feed or became fertilizer. And so China was actually quite aware of how important keeping food from being wasted is that it was an important part of animal feed and also important fertilizer. During the Green Revolution in the 1980s and the introduction of high yielding plants and fertilizers, all of a sudden the need to collect and apply organic fertilizer started to diminish, and more food was starting to get wasted. But the big change came a few years ago when a big disease problem hit China. African swine fever swept through China, and we published a blog on this. And more than a quarter of the pigs in China died, and of African swine fever. And China's the #1 pork producer in the world. So that was a very, very serious problem in terms of food security and food loss. But when they were looking for why did this disease spread, they found that food waste could contain the virus. So they changed their policies and outlawed feeding food waste to animals. So overnight, what was not a food waste problem suddenly became a food waste problem. All the restaurant waste and all the food in the villages that were all collected and fed to animals suddenly was being wasted. And so, the unintended consequences of a government policy, we kind of see this all the time.
Yeah.
So they thought they were solving one problem, and then they created a different problem. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't treat the food waste to make sure that it doesn't spread disease. And we do that type of research in the United States, and they're starting to do that type of research in China. And why it's so important for the intellectual capacity of these two food superpowers to work together to solve some of these really important climate problems.
Jennifer, I've known you long enough to know that you are an optimist and a positive person by nature.
Yes.
But any discussion of climate, there's a ticking clock in the background, right? Are we moving quickly enough to mitigate the worst outcomes? And I wonder, even though this is a growth industry that you're talking about, a focus on food as it relates to climate, are we scaling up? Are we moving quickly enough? Are things happening in a way where we can be optimistic?
I mean, it is really encouraging, like what we've been seeing in the US. I mentioned the investments into climate smart agriculture, but even more important is looking at the trends of the states, not just California, but even in the Midwest, where there are examples where farmers are no dummies, right? They see that the need to protect their soil is important, and that's why we have a fairly high rate of no-till and a little bit more openness to these practices. But again, they're not always billed as being climate smart agriculture, because that kind of makes whatever everyone else is doing just climate dumb. No, but the idea that protecting the soil, protecting your yields, that those, that kind of language. So it's also about, how you're going to approach the farmers. And I think the people that are focusing on, encouraging these kind of policies, I think are getting a little bit smarter. Hopefully they're talking to people like Karen so that people know how to make policies and talk to farmers. I want to say one thing, in terms of sensitivities.
Yes.
So one thing that when we were talking with our Chinese partners, they told us that one area that's sensitive is that Chinese people don't like the idea if foreigners are coming in to tell them that they shouldn't eat meat.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that's even true in the US. People are very protective, I want my beef or whatever. I mean, and so that's why we're very careful. We're not here pointing fingers at individual consumers about their choices, but there is, something different in China too, as I could say now, if I can jump over to the food waste issue. When I was in China in 1980s, as the reforms are taking off, and it was a real status symbol that you would order too much food at a restaurant, and you'd leave food on the plates, and it would kill me. I would bring Tupperware and put it in. They're like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "It's called a doggy bag." Now people they box their things up because people are realizing, well, why was I wasting money? And even under the new policies, both the campaign and the new law, that both at national and sometimes at provincial levels, there's also kind of like a food waste little fee that you get paid, and that restaurants sometimes won't allow you to order more than one dish for the number of people that are at the table. I mean, it's kind of like, Mama Beijing telling you what to do, but at the same time, it does educate the population.
Yeah. If they had met my grandmother ahead of her time, just leaving food on my plate was like a capital offense, which explains a lot. Anyway, thank you, both of you. This has been a fascinating conversation. Before we close, I'm smart enough to know what I don't know. And so we've talked about a lot, but are there important things we haven't touched on that you think are important to mention before we close out? And maybe one of those things would be a bit of a plug. Tell us about what you have coming up and what resources are available on your website.
Well, actually, I mean, this video will be out by then, but tonight I'm having a conversation with 2 American and 2 Chinese food waste experts. We're having an evening webinar. It'll be on our website talking about, putting food on the climate action table in the US and China. But also if you don't want to go looking around our website, just type in Cool Agriculture Wilson Center, and you'll get to a whole collection page of a lot of our blogs. Karen's written lots of them. She's very prolific. Blogs, webinars, podcasts, our reports. We're constantly going to be adding to this. And we're hoping, we're going to expand more into looking at like transport of food, I don't know, EV tractors, cold chain, subnational cooperation. It's like the field is huge, John, for areas that we could work on in this. And, at the Wilson Center, we pride ourselves in trying to find, mind the gaps. Where are there opportunities?
Connecting the dots.
Connecting the
good
dots.
stuff. Good
So
stuff.
we've done that.
Terrific. Thanks, Jennifer. Karen, I will give you a final word. What do you know? The Ohio State University gets the final word today.
Well, I guess one of the things that I also want to say is that when you go to our resources, you'll find many of them are not there in English, but they're also in Chinese. We produced a series of podcasts, and they're both in English and they're in Chinese. And they're not just translated, they're original podcasts in Chinese and in English. Our roadmap is right now being put out in Chinese. It's not, I don't think, posted yet, but it will be. And many of our blogs are also in Chinese. So, we're not just limiting our communication to English language speakers, but we are reaching out to the wider group that are interested in China environment.
Well, sincere thanks to both of you for today, but also for your ongoing work. This is really what you're doing, the Wilson Center at its best, right? It's not always chasing headlines, but it's identifying trend lines and really coming up with some stuff that can change our lives for the better in the long run. Thank you very much, Karen Mancl, Jennifer Turner. To our viewers, we hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now and that you'll take advantage of those materials on the China Environment Forum website. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky, thanking you for your time and interest.